very much for a fascinating set of talks. So we have about 20 minutes, I guess, 20, 25 minutes for discussion. So I'd like to open it to discussion with questions from the audience. But I realize it takes some time to, I guess, start building up the questions. So let me actually perhaps start with asking a question to the panel speakers. This was a fascinating discussion. Each of the speakers touched upon various different aspects or various different issues that led to this crisis that we've observed. Daron mentioned, I guess, the effect of interconnections. Simon talked about centralization, effects of centralization, and in Paul's case, we've seen how small risks associated with mortgages accentuated and led to much bigger effects. I guess the first question that comes to mind from that is, what do all these discussions imply about regulations that should be put in place so that we can deal better with these instabilities? So what kind of regulations should we be thinking about? What are the most important ones? So.
Okay, we don't have enough time to cover the entire topic, but I really I would just pick up a couple of things that Paul said, actually, because my recollection from listening to Federal Reserve briefings and other analysis in 2007, 2008 was exactly what Paul said, which is the understanding of the Fed and others of housing was very good and very precise and, in retrospect, substantially correct. What we didn't understand was the way the risks would get amplified through derivatives and across financial institutions of different kinds. So that's the global crisis. And so you asked about regulation, so I'm going to ask you about analysis and computer science, Asu. I think I am not convinced that we have made a lot of progress in understanding that what derivative structure or what interconnections, but I think it's mostly derivatives, what amplifies and what dampens the risk, right? And so if I don't know that, and you can't show me that, and you can't convince me with the theory and the data, then I think I have to err on the side of more restrictions and more regulations of various kinds that obviously people in the industry are not very happy about. But I really don't think we know enough about what a safe set of derivative interconnections looks like and what a dangerous one looks like. And I'm particularly confident we don't know what that would look like across borders, because we have very little visibility into the real-time net derivative exposure position of any large financial institution outside the United States. OFR can't go there, for example, with their usual data subpoena powers or any other access. And this is huge, right? This is half the world's financial system is, potentially can blow itself up on these derivatives because they trade a lot and they're big relative to us and they're very connected with us through trade and through financial flows. So I think I'm shoving it back on you, Asu. Once you've sorted this out from a network stability point of view, we can sort out the regulation.
Thank you. Great. So, any others?
So, I'll jump in there on resolution. So a lot of what we focus on at the OFR is thinking about crises. Not everything's about crises, but that's clearly an important issue. And I'm agnostic about whether we'll ever be able to adequately predict crises, but where we should have some hope for is more effective resolution regimes. And one of the things that struck me about Lehman in particular was the change in attitudes of the market participants during a crisis. So usually the big financial institutions would rather not see the regulators there. In the midst of a crisis, they are very happy to see the regulators there and willing to share whatever information, do whatever it takes to save things. And having the infrastructure in place, again, this is an implementation issue, having the infrastructure in place to ingest a lot of portfolio information in short order and map the interconnections could be huge. One thing in particular to keep your eye on is something called the Qualified Financial Contracts Proposal, which I think folks at the FDIC have been working on. This is a regulation that went through notice and comment earlier this year to collect fairly elaborate detail on the interbank or interinstitutional exposures for large firms.
Jump in? I mean, I was thinking Simon is his usual being extremely modest. First of all, what he ascribed to Acemoglu Robinson is also the great book by Johnson and Quack. But also, I mean, of that book and of your talk, I thought there was a rather straightforward corollary, which you're not saying, that regulation, the most effective one would be to reduce the size of banks. Not the sort of the more detailed regulation of how you play around with these things, but just if they are small, you know, Paul suggested, you suggested, you know, it's one of the things that I put on the, you know, a lot of the contagion here is coming from correlated risk-taking of a large number of large institutions, perhaps. Well, the hedge funds were taking all sorts of crazy positions, but the crazy positions sort of are not all correlated as a result of that. So it's really the large banks. So if they were not so big, the correlated shocks wouldn't translate into such big sort of things, which I thought was your view, but you're not articulating it.
Well, first of all, Doron, I'm a guest here, and I read the sponsors list thank you for putting it back up. I read that list quite carefully this morning, so I was treading delicately. But look, I think
not anymore.
I think that the sort of analytical issue there that's so a couple of things interesting, right? So one, and this was the point of the Minneapolis conference on Monday, how big is too big to fail if you think that there is some level above which you get some additional protection. So in Ben Bernanke's book, chapter 10, he has this very nice blow by blow of March 2008. He says, Peloton Partners failed, that was a hedge fund, 2-3 billion. Thornburg Mortgage failed, that was about 34 billion. He was very sorry to see them go. He thought they were completely being sort of knocked over by circumstances beyond their control. And Carlyle Capital, very influential group of people behind them, but it's kind of a speculative, very leveraged bet on the instruments that Paul was talking about. They also failed. Taken together, that was $61 billion, and Bernanke says, wasn't enough to justify extraordinary measures. Then Bear Stearns, very shortly afterwards, is in big trouble. That was 400 billion with a risk exposure, depending on how we treat the netting, maybe it was 600, you might say it was 600 billion. That was too big. That the Fed couldn't allow to go down, or at least they worked strenuously to prevent damage to creditors and losses for counterparties. So I think, Doron, it does come back to, I think it comes back to, I'm all in favor of interconnections and your work on that and understanding that, totally important. And we know that from money market funds, for example, it's not particularly about size. It was the nature of the instrument and the way that those interconnections work or are perceived to work. But for leveraged intermediaries, banks, however people operate like banks, whatever you call them legally, I think that the size issue does matter, but I want to understand also what are the dynamics. If we make them smaller, how does that change the dynamics of the system? Are there unintended consequences? That's a very fair question. Could we unintentionally build something that would have different and not attractive stability properties under some circumstances? And that was, I think, what you were getting at in your presentation.
Okay. Well, we have many.
Yes. One question, especially to the OFR special group. I worked during the crisis time in a specialized market called the dealer market. Nobody talks much about it, but that's the heart of where, on an OTC basis, the various institutions basically trade with one another. It was very clear, and we were trading CDSs, CDOs, etc. It was very clear for the professionals who were trading with one another that they were starting to box certain institutions out of trades. So the insiders had some inkling that something was brewing. And this was not just on a national basis. Basically, we were working on a global basis with maybe 20 of the largest banks, counterparties in the world, trading extraordinary volatile data, and the CDS charts that you have, and CDOs, etc., were all viewed. It's only post facto, when Lehman hit, Bear hit, Lehman hit, etc., that suddenly we had the regulator come and start trying to learn about the mechanisms of that market, the instruments, and then eventually tries to potentially interpret the data. Are there now mechanisms in place or policies being envisioned to, on a systematic basis, start introducing monitoring systems and possibly gating thresholds, etc., the same way as we do on exchanges?
So I think this is actually a very hard problem. You know, politics is harder than economics, is the gist of it. So think about Lehman again. If the regulators are monitoring, turn it around. Two cases. One is Lehman fails, one they don't. If they fail and it's revealed after the fact that the supervisors knew everything, then the supervisors before the fact, with all the information in front of them, are going to have an incentive to micromanage the firms. And I don't think we want that, any of us. So negotiating this balance between how much do you know, when do you know it, and how much discretion you're going to allow yourself for intervention is a very difficult balance to strike.
So I, like many people in the room, are very interested by blockchain technologies in the application of finance, which I guess you can talk about this afternoon. And just on this point, though, one of the things that interests us at MIT, we have a project based in the Media Lab on this. Sandy Pentland is also involved somewhere in the room. It is, you know, what kind of information is available and to whom, and to what extent you can show people. I think what you just put your finger on is this key dynamic that happens in a lot of crises, which is a few people start to realize that something's going wrong, and they start to pull away from these other people, and then that information sort of disseminates in this domino type or cascading type.
Billion-dollar trades, tickets, notional tickets.
Right.
That were passed.
So now we have, or you have, and the industry has, and obviously there's a lot of innovation here. There's going to be some choices to be made about how information is shared, how clearing and settlement proceeds, what you can see in real time, both as traders and as management and as boards and as risk committees and as supervisors and as regulators. These are huge strategic choices, and I think, you know, subject to the same Acemoglu point, which is where's the theory and where's the empirics. My intuition is that you were going to do better with a more transparent, more visible system, subject to privacy concerns, subject to protecting proprietary rights and information, fine. But I think better sharing of more of this kind of updated information earlier is going to be helpful, I think, to system stability.
Questions?
Yeah, I would. Quick question about the theory. I think there's interest in connecting the data to the models, and one question about that is the data that we need available to academicians and researchers in a place like our DSS to validate these models? And the second thing, how do we deal with questions of causal inference and latent variables in some of the questions that we'll talk about?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was talking about at the end. I think that's absolutely central, and I was particularly insistent on that because there's a danger that might sort of fall by the wayside when we talk about big data because it opens so many opportunities, but that's no substitute. It's got to be a complement to being careful about causality. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the data we need are not available because they're proprietary and the Fed doesn't collect it, or the US system, you know. In Europe, some of these data are available. OFC, I guess, so OFR has some of these data, but they don't share it always. But, you know, for instance, for financial structures, the sort of data you need is to understand some of these contagion type topics is you need clearly identified shocks that hit one institution, and holding everything else, you can actually sort of look at them travel through the system and then worry about the sort of the correlation shocks that. But at that level of granularity, a lot of data are not available. For example, in some European countries, you have loan level data for applications and how applications are turned down or not in a mortgage level. I'm pretty sure US must have that, but the one that's made available doesn't actually let you do this level of granular analysis. So I think there's a lot more to be done. But I think the getting the sort of the empirical and the theoretical frame or econometric frame for asking the right questions is absolutely central here, and I think this is an area that a lot more thinking needs to be done, because I think a lot of people come into this area sort of attracted by the questions, attracted by the richness of the data, and you can play with the data, some aspects of the data in a very interesting way, but that's going to be from there to jumping to asking those causal questions is not always a walk in the park.
I'll just jump in quickly on the data availability. It's something that we're very interested at the OFR. So there's a will, not clear that there's a way. So we want to be very conscientious about licensed, proprietary, and confidential data. A couple ways that we've been trying to finesse the issue. So on one of my projects, working with outside academics, we're sharing the code, not the data. So effectively, I'm working as the research assistant. And that's a model that can work. It takes a little bit of discipline, but it's workable. Another thing is we are, and in fact, we just announced an OFR Fellows program, so we formalized this. But we do take on academic visitors. The spring round has closed, but I understand we're going to do it on a semi-annual basis going forward. So watch out for that. That would allow academics to come in. As effectively OFR employees.
So if I could add to that. So the Office of Financial Research has a Financial Research Advisory Committee. I'm on that committee also. More good parties, okay? And they have some openings now. They have a rotating membership, and I really think it would be great to have more independent academic type data scientists on that committee. It doesn't set OFR policy. It's a consultative body. But it gives you a lot of insight into the working of the OFR, and I'm very supportive of that organization. I think, go back to Dron's point, if we had very clear specification, demonstration of, what are the key issues to get at, what the data are, and how in other places you can get at them, OFR actually has subpoena power across the entire financial sector. Now, it has to be compelling. They don't want to use that subpoena power. I also wish and hope that more private sector people would share their data, and that can be done on a completely confidential, protected basis. But I think, as Doron's absolutely right, it's got to be transaction. To really get at these questions, it's got to be transaction-level data, including everything that went into that transaction as much as possible.
We have more, so one more.
I'm surprised that none of the speakers talked about the Jobs Act. In theory, the Jobs Act was all about too big to fail, and the big banks essentially being replaced by peer-to-peer lending and other peer-to-peer activities. Is it too early to see that actually have an impact on the banking system, or is it going to fail? Because everyone's talking about how to make the old system better, as opposed to replacing the old system by something completely different.
I guess I would say that, just my personal opinion, that none of the post-crisis reforms have been fully tested yet. We have not. The boat has not gone through a storm, and we will not know for sure until that happens.
Yeah, I think the Jobs Act was about some other things, and not much about too big to fail. Peer-to-peer lending is a fascinating question, and I think that's something that, studying that using conventional technology, how it's affected by potential blockchain technology is also going to be a great question, subject to being able to get our hands on the data. The piece that worries me, though, linking back to Paul's presentation, is, I think Goldman Sachs did a report on this a year or two ago now, in which it seemed like we were moving beyond sort of literal peer-to-peer towards sort of intermediated peer-to-peer or peer-to-peer intermediate. And so therefore, and it seemed to me that we were starting to securitize that. And then once the leveraged intermediaries start getting into it, it's a very different structure. That's one thing. The second thing is the nature of contracts. So to what extent this it comes up in peer-to-peer, but not only in peer-to-peer. If you had more data about people's performance, and if you could track that, the reporting of that, for example, through a blockchain distributed ledger type approach, relying on debt as the basis for those kinds of interactions, I think would be less appealing. I'm sure would be less appealing. Debt is not a very good contract from systemic stability points of view, for obvious reasons, and even from an individual incentive point of view. But we don't like contingent contracts because they come with lots and lots of incentive issues. To the extent to which we can design peer-to-peer to actually build in more of those contingent payoffs in a reasonable way without abusive behavior and so on, that I think has great potential. But that's a longer-term project.
So perhaps one last question.
Thank you. Bill Benjamin, just you raised Professor Johnson the board issue. Maybe we could just get some comments on the evolving role of boards in this, particularly independent directors and how are boards getting data?
I think this is one of the biggest questions for this group, for example, and much more broadly, because now some new technologies are arriving that give boards the potential, risk committees included, the opportunity to see, potentially net risk exposure on a real-time basis, right? Now, if boards don't take up that technology, people are going to be asking why. Investors are going to be asking why, right? It seems that just from a monitoring and information flow within the organization, it's compelling. Now, if the organization can see it, then shouldn't the supervisor also be able to see it under appropriate conditions that are clearly specified? I think that's going to be very hard to resist. And shouldn't the systemic regulator be able to say, not see every transaction, that wouldn't be appropriate or even helpful, but shouldn't they be able to say, look, what's this anomaly over here? This is something we haven't seen before, and the appropriate people unlock that data, and it's AIG Financial Products in London, right? That seems very helpful and very constructive, and I think the industry gains from that, as well as all our confidence about whether we really know what's going on from a supervisory regulatory point of view.
Okay. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. We'll have a break now and continue with our